I think this is exactly the opportunity that the highest spheres of the Iranian regime were waiting for, is after all these proceedings and all the mourning period, the 3 days of having to bury Qasem Soleimani, first doing the ceremonies in Iraq, then in Tehran, and then in his hometown. Now he came to the stage, to the center stage, to outline his the battle of narratives, the battle of frames that the Iranian regime wants to capitalize on after the death of Qasem Soleimani, that is, and this means for them to, and if you analyze the discourse that has been emanating, you can see that he has been talking about the story of Soleimani and elevating him to the rank of a martyr, so to speak, in order to resonate with the masses. Let us not forget that the Shiite persuasion of Islam has a lot of affinities with the cult of death and dying and martyrization. The whole Shiite persuasion started as a political contest and then become a religion only afterwards. And the religion came about the martyrization of the son of Ali, the fourth caliph in Islam, and we're talking 680 AD. So this is very far away in history, but this is still something that the regime is playing on, is this analogy or this parallel between Hussein, which is one of the pillars of the heroes in the mindset of the Shiite persuasion, and Qasem Soleimani now becomes another chapter in this history of martyrization, of victimhood. So he plays a lot on that, and this is why you see the people are resonating, and then they are really entranced and starting to cry at some stage about his death. So he elevated him to the rank of saint or martyr, and he started talking about the whole phase. But of course, what struck me really strongly is the fact that he whitewashed also some of the deeds of Soleimani. Soleimani was responsible for some of the heavy repression in Iran in the 80s. Like if people don't remember that, the Kurdish, there was strong Kurdish uprising in Iran, and Qasem Soleimani was one of the main pillars of the regime in repressing very heavily. A lot of people died. So this is not a faint-hearted man. This is not an angel, maybe an angel of death, so to speak, at that time, and then afterwards externally. But the regime is whitewashing all this. It's just like playing this narrative. He's been a resistance fighter. He has been all over the place. He was like playing a big role against Israel, and so on and so forth. So for me, what was striking is that this was a propaganda for the regime. It was a very big occasion for the regime to whitewash everything and also let people forget, because if you see, the beginning started with Qasem Soleimani, the end was more on the protests against the regime, which he said these are elements, these are rogue elements, these are elements that are led by the US to destabilize Iran. So now he delegitimizes the whole protest movements and then play this good and evil kind of binary mode.
You bringing this up reminds me of a conversation I had yesterday with an Iranian who said she worshipped Soleimani, but she didn't like everything that he did. For example, his support for Bashar al-Assad, his regime in Syria. We don't hear enough about him, a balanced sense of who he truly was, and why, I guess, the US considers him a terrorist. Let's look at that. Is he a terrorist in the true sense of what the US is referring to?
Well, if you analyze the whole trajectory, of course, there have been a lot of attacks against non-combatants. So this stands out in the lexicon, in the jurisprudence. This is terrorism, because even if you strike against a military personnel, but this military personnel is not active or not actively in service at that time, this means that this is an act of terrorism. This happened a lot. A lot of embassies of the U.S. embassies were bombed. A lot of personnel, U.S. personnel in Lebanon. If you remember, in 1983, there were very important operations against U.S. personnel while they were sleeping in their bases. So Qasem Soleimani was one of the pillars of the Iranian regime against all these forces, the United States, the France, Britain. He did a lot of operations against Kuwait, against Saudi Arabia. So from that perspective, yes, he is responsible for a lot of death. In the Syrian war, a lot of people died because of some operations of these militias that are very strongly connected to the Iranian regime, and they were actually under the orders of Qasem Soleimani. So a lot of this death, massive deaths, maybe hundreds of thousands of deaths, civilians mostly died because of that, because the regime, and we can see also that in the propaganda that's emanating today and all these speeches, is the regime wants to have the upper hand over West Asia. Remember, this is something that was said in the speech, West Asia. He didn't say Middle East, he didn't say MENA, like Middle East and North Africa, he said West Asia. So he's sending a signal to the United States that this is where we want. This is the theater of play where we want to have our, concentrate our force, and we want you out of this. We want to have the whole hegemony over this region. And this is something that is really worrying from my perspective. It tells me that despite the attacks that occurred overnight on the Al-Assad base in Iraq, the kind of retaliation by the Iranian forces was expected, and the fact that there are no casualties, or at least U.S. casualties in the base, mean that this is like Iran offering an off-ramp to Trump to tell him that, okay, we are retaliating, but this is, for us, it doesn't mean that we are going to escalate any further. So let's go back to the closed doors and discuss some way out of this crisis.
Can we go back to what happened just before the strike last week, Friday? A lot of U.S. media is saying that it was a deserved strike against Qasem Soleimani. He was a terrorist. He had it coming. He was planning things. He was planning to hurt more Americans. Does Western media, in your opinion, truly understand who Qasem Soleimani was?
Well, Qasem Soleimani has been active in the international scene since the late 70s, early 80s. His name started popping in the media radar, so to speak, since like the attacks that occurred against a U.S. embassy in Kuwait, and then also attacks on Iraqi embassies in Kuwait and Lebanon, and then the rise of Hezbollah. So Qasem Soleimani has been known for quite some time for those who are following the Middle East. Qasem Soleimani is no angel, let's be frank with each other. He lived by the sword and he died by the sword. So this is something to be expected in that kind of situations. However, of course, given that he has multiple hats, he is the equivalent of the head of the CIA. He is the equivalent of the head of the military special forces, and he is a special envoy of the Iranian state. These are three functions he was filling, so this is a major thing. Having him as a target is a major slap to the face of the Iranian regime. So, of course, there will be a retaliation. There will be a tit for tat. That's for sure. This is how this international business goes. However, there's still always room for diplomacy. I think both sides, for both sides, the honeymoon is over, obviously, with his death. However, there is now discussion over the custody, so to speak, of the children, and Iraq is the main protagonist in that regard.
U.S. President Donald Trump previously said he was looking at 52 sites that he could target to retaliate. We're not too sure if he's still going to look at those things, but Iran has promised that if the U.S. retaliates, it would hit U.S. allies in the region, including Israel. Does what is happening right now in the Middle East, as someone who lives in the region, make you nervous?
Actually, to be honest, it's déjà vu. We have seen this before. We have seen it since the 80s. I've witnessed the Iraq-Iran war in the 80s. I've seen all the things that have been happening in the region since that period. And there are definitely a lot of things that are happening, a lot of tensions, a lot of tit-for-tat actions from different protagonists. I think what we are witnessing here is another cycle, maybe, of getting to escalate before going to a de-escalation phase. The major thing at stake here is whether the U.S. is willing to stay in the Middle East or is it going to withdraw? Because let's again be blunt here, the Obama policies were a disastrous thing for the United States presence in the Middle East. And now Trump doesn't want to really withdraw, but doesn't want really to commit. So the Iranians, and especially Qasem Soleimani, was testing the American willingness to stay in the Middle East by pushing further the envelope every day, every time, day in, day out. And he obviously got that response late because this is an election year, and Trump wants also to have some wins in this political game. So moving forward, I see that there will be another cycle of probably of escalation, but it's not going to be against necessarily U.S. targets. My own guess and estimation would be that something is going to happen in the Gulf, and I think this is something that's going to make the Iranians very happy because they have their enemies there, especially Saudi Arabia and others, and they have done it before. They have managed to strike Saudi Arabia in its soft belly. They have, if you remember, the strikes against Aramco, which is a major thing in Saudi Arabia, happened, and there was no absolutely zero consequence for the Iranians. Why shouldn't they do again the same thing? So this is a question I would ask, and I think this is where the real thing would happen, because they will strike two birds by one stone. At the same time, they will show to their own people in Iran and outside Iran that we are striking, we are retaliating. At the same time, they are striking not to somewhere where it can hit them back hard, like the United States targets. They're going to do it against the Saudis or others who, at the same time are their eternal rivals in the region.
And of course, escalation is not what anyone wants. Iran's Information Minister Zari Jahromi says, he tweeted rather, "Get the hell out of our region." Is that a solution? If the US leaves, maybe the coalition leaves as well, we don't know. Would that leave the Middle East safer?
Well, I think there's a lot of rhetorics here. I don't think the United States will leave the Middle East, because leaving the Middle East means opening the doors to China and other contenders. This is not something that the United States is really looking forward to having as a situation. I think the Iranians are pushing the envelope. They are trying to gain more leverage in this kind of negotiations. Let's not forget that at the end, war and conflict and violent conflict is just the continuation of politics by other means. This is what the strategy, like the master of strategy, Clausewitz, said like about three centuries ago. He said, war is the continuation of politics via other means. And this is what the Iranians are trying. They are trying to push in the envelope, having more say. They want to build this, this kind of aura in the region, and having all these countries under their yoke. However, the United States doesn't see it this way. So it's going to be a little bit of back and forth before they reach a real compromise.